Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your patience. We just wanted to make sure everything was working properly before we started. My name is Pauline Meekins, and I'd like to welcome you to the Royal Society of Chemistry and to our Chemistry Centre here tonight, and for our lecture, Fighting Food Fraud from Hassall to Horsemeat, and a warm welcome to our speaker, Dr. Duncan Campbell. I'd also like to welcome our online viewers. We've had a slight little hitch tonight, but I hope we're going live now, to anyone who's watching the lecture. And if you are watching online, you can join us via Twitter, following the RSC account at rsc_comms and using the hashtag RSC Public Lectures. Just a reminder to everybody in the audience, mobile phones do actually interfere with our webcasting, so if you've got your mobile phones on, we would appreciate you turn them off, or at minimum turn them on to silent if you can't bear to turn them off, so that would be very grateful. Thank you. Just a few health and safety. We're not expecting to activate any fire alarms this evening, so if you hear a fire alarm, it probably means we've got a fire. Not to alarm you, but if you could make your way out of the back door, down the staircase and into the courtyard. If that way should be a place of danger, we do have an alternative route through these doors here. The screen will go up and we'll make our way through the Geological Society into Piccadilly. Some of you will probably have found out we unfortunately don't have any toilets on this floor, so if you need to if you're sort of rush out of here, make your way down the stairs into the ground floor. They're on the left-hand side. We have got a couple of public events coming up in the next few weeks. Some of you may know we have National Chemistry Week in a week's time, and during that week, on Wednesday the 20th of November, we are having one of our chemical lunch boxes. This is obviously held at lunchtime. It's from 12:30 to 1:30. And our theme through the week is on health, and you'll be surprised to know that our theme for the lunchbox is cheese, and the title is Cheeses Are Good for Your Health, and will be given by Richard Marshall, who's a senior lecturer at Food Enterprise at Bath Spa University. It's an hour-long lunchtime talk with a lunch provided. Tickets are £10 for adults and £6 for children. And if you like to book for that, registration will be online very soon. So there's also another event coming up in December, which is the final one of our monthly public lectures for 2013. And the title of this one is Not Just for Christmas, Making the Most of Your Christmas Tree. And it's a lecture given by Professor Matthew Davidson from the University of Bath Centre for Sustainable Chemical Technologies, who's going to discuss how such valuable resources, in particular the terpenes that trees produce, offer the potential to develop a wide range of renewable products, from fine chemicals to biofuels. We're also working on our 2014 public lecture programme. We're getting a number of lectures in place, but just to flag up, in January, our first event will be on the 9th of January, and it will actually be a whisky tasting, which ties in. The Royal Society of Chemistry is actually having a book on whisky, which is bringing out at the end of the year. So, and we thought that might tie in quite nicely with Burns Night, although it will be the 9th of January. So registration will be that online very soon too. So just before I move on to the lecture, if you could all, we do appreciate you filling in your feedback forms. I say this every lecture, but we do read them very carefully, and we do appreciate your comments, good and bad, and if you'd like to fill them in before you leave. If you want to take your form away and send it in, we do have a free post envelope outside in the library, and you can pick one up as you leave. And if you could leave your forms either in the box outside or hand them to a member of staff. And also, if you could leave your badges on reception when you go out, they do get quite expensive to replace, so that would be much appreciated. So we'll now move on to tonight's lecture, and I'd like to introduce our chair for this evening, and we're very privileged to have Dr. Derrick Smith here tonight for this lecture. Derrick is our Chief Scientific Officer, Managing Director of Science and Technology and Government Chemist at the LGC, where he is responsible for the leadership of teams delivering R&D programs in analytical, quality and metrology, providing regulatory-related analysis, and supplying services to the pharmaceutical and chemical industries. Derrick joined LGC in 1991 and has previously carried out a variety of research and development roles relating to new methods of analysis. Prior to becoming government chemist, Derrick was responsible for LGC's pharmaceutical business and managed operations in the UK and Germany that supplied a comprehensive range of reference material products and high-quality analytical services in areas such as product compliance testing, impurity profiling, teachables and extractables testing, and particle characterization. His research interests include micro-nanotechnology, which is lab on a chip, and advanced separation science and spectroscopy and bioanalysis. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Derrick Craston, who will introduce the lecture tonight. Thank you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this RSC event. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Duncan Campbell. Duncan's a fellow Scotsman. He was born and brought up in Stirlingshire and started off his life as an environmental chemist, getting his degree at Edinburgh University, a PhD in Oxford, and then moving on to study at the University of Reading. But what he's going to be talking about tonight, his first venture into it was back in 1988 when he moved to Humberside Public Analysts Laboratory. And in that institution, he held a number of different roles involved in environmental work, radiochemistry, consumer products, and environmental testing. He obtained his mastership in chemical analysis in 1994, and that, of course, is a statutory qualification for appointment as public analyst. It's an award that's given by the Royal Society of Chemistry. And during his days at Hull, not only was he working hard as an analyst and learning to be, studying to be a master of chemical analysis, he found time to be the scientific advisor to the County Council Environmental Subcommittee. He left Humberside in 1996 and joined West Yorkshire Analytical Services, where he was involved in a number of public analyst activities through to heading the laboratory in 1997. And the West Yorkshire Analytical Services services not just the local authority, but authorities spreading as wide as Derbyshire and right up to Teesside. Duncan has been very active professionally. He's honorary secretary currently, and the immediate past president of the Association of Public Analysts. He's represented the Association of Public Analysts on many committees and the Royal Society on many committees. He has, for example, stood on the Analytical Methods Committee of the Royal Society of Chemistry, and he is on the steering group of the Food Analysis Performance Assessment Scheme, amongst many other activities. Duncan is very active in terms of publicising the work of the public analyst profession, and we're really looking forward to hearing him talk now on fighting food fraud from Hassall to Horsemeat. Duncan, please.
Thank you, Derrick. It's a pleasure to be in the company of the government chemist. Relationships between public analysts and the government chemist have not always been good, but that's not to say that I think it's good to have a government chemist who's a chemist, and I think relationships between our profession and your referee role have never been better. I think I can say that. So thank you for those warm words of introduction. Right, I suggested to the Society that I might give this talk back in March to mark the 60th anniversary of the founding of the Association of Public Analysts. And at that time, little did I know that Horsemeat would still be very much in the news. We've had various reviews, select committee, EU parliamentary committees, all looking into what has become known as the Horsemeat scandal. And only yesterday... Right, well, I'm wearing a microphone, so I'm hoping it's going to do the work. And I've obviously pressed the wrong button on there. All right now? Not, sorry, a gentleman still shaking his head. Yeah. So I'll keep. I don't want to be that loud. I don't want to be rumbling. Is that better? Right. Okay. Right. Well, I'll try and press the right button now. So only last week, some more horsemeat turned up, and we've. So it's still very much around us, despite all the work there has been. Food adulteration has been around for a long time. If you were in church on the 22nd of September, you might have heard these words as part of the Old Testament reading from the book of Amos, which was written in the 4th century BC. But even 2.5 millennia before that, cuneiform tablets found in Ebla in modern-day Syria describe investigators who were charged with investigating and combating olive oil fraud. Because today the trade in olive oils is worth about 15 billion euros annually. So it's obviously a big trade today. And Tom Miller, in his book Extra Virginity, described numerous frauds, some of them extremely large. How am I doing for sound level? Yeah, I've gone down again, have I? Right. Would it be? I'll just wait for technical assistance. Right, I've been told to try again. I don't sound very loud, do I? I can't hear myself coming back. Would I be better on these microphones, the lectern mics? Keep talking. Oh, I frightened myself when yeah, that's very loud, isn't it? But it wasn't until the Industrial Revolution came to Britain, coming as it did at the time of the repeal of the Corn Laws, that we saw widespread adulteration of staple foods. A number of individuals at that time applied a variety of scientific methods to detect adulteration. And in my title, of course, I've referred to Hassall, partly because it goes quite well with horsemeat. But I'd like to begin a little bit before then and talk about Frederick Accum. This is Frederick Hacken. I've gone again, haven't I? Yeah. This is Frederick Accum here, lecturing to the Surrey Institution. He was a German chemist, born in the same year as Wellington and Napoleon, the son of a Westphalian soap maker who died when Frederick was 3. His career was one of a meteoric rise, combining a fine mind with a popular touch. But however, to Humphrey Davy, who was a contemporary of his, and saw himself as the defender of the honour of science, Accum was, and I quote, a cheat and a quack. More recently, perhaps through the rose-tinted spectacles of historical perspective, writer B. Wilson has likened him to a celebrity chef. But perhaps there isn't that much difference between the two in any case, I don't know. He lectured, he gave private tuition, he supplied chemicals and apparatus, an expert in the production of coal gas. He supplied a lot of chemical equipment to the beginnings of chemistry teaching and work in the United States. And in addition to this, he analysed hundreds of food samples. Now, he published a treatise on the adulteration of food and culinary poisons in 1820. It's better known as Death in the Pot, and I'm pleased to say that the RSC Library has provided us with a copy in the display case there, along with a number of other books, some of which I may refer to in passing this evening. So by 1820, fraudsters were using a little bit of chemical knowledge to cover up inadequacies in staple foods and make inferior ingredients look and taste the part. And by applying sound scientific knowledge, Accum felt he could not be denounced as a scaremonger because he was applying science to identify the problems. and he used what we today would consider simple qualitative tests to reveal the presence of adulterants in foods. For example, by adding a few drops of a solution of iodine in alcohol to cream, if there was starch present, which was sometimes added to thicken it up, obviously we'd get the blue colour of the starch-iodine complex. Of course, starches are still used in dairy products to this day, but usually, and one of the things we check in my day job, of course, is that the presence of the starches is declared in the label. Caroline Walker, who many of you will remember the name, very famous nutritionist, and she has a trust named after her. She said that, you know, adulteration was still with us. It's just that it was called additives today rather than, right, you know, it had the things had a name, therefore they weren't adulterants. Accum also had a thing about lemonade. At that time, tartaric acid rather than lemon juice was used to make it. And he recommended the addition of a concentration solution of muriate of potash, which is potassium chloride, to us younger chemists, which would yield the precipitated potassium hydrogen tartrate, which you may know as cream of tartar if tartaric acid was present. Just how practical it was to carry a little vial of potassium chloride solution about with you, it remains to be seen. The book had quite a long title, which is perhaps why it became to be known as Death in the Pot. And you'll notice he uses the word sophistication there, along with fraudulent. And there isn't a satisfactory definition of sophistication in terms of food, but he used it about 30 times in Death in the Pot compared to 177 uses of words based on adulterate. And I see sophistication as a process whereby one fraud in a food is then covered up or attempted to be covered up by another one, and I will illustrate that as we go on. Accum came to rather a sudden end as far as his career in Britain was concerned. He had a habit, he was obviously a very busy man, prolific writer and working very hard, and he had a habit of tearing pages out of books in libraries, particularly the Library of the Royal Institution. Now, whether this was a got-up charge and somebody perhaps was being lent on by the food industry lobby of the day and said, you need to get rid of Accum, we don't know. But rather than sort of stand charge, he disappeared back to Germany and sort of restarted his career there. And the momentum that Accum was beginning to build up was lost, and things went back to much as they were for another 30 years or so. And although there were advances in chemistry at this time, there was a limit of what could be achieved. Partly due to not knowing what normal was in terms of food and various other problems. And this led Sir Charles Wood, who was the Chancellor of Exchequer in 1847, saying that 3 distinguished chemists had told them that neither by chemistry nor in any other way can the admixture of coffee with chicory be detected. The inference there being that, well, if you can't detect it, why should we get bothered about it? So this is where Arthur Hill Hassall sort of comes on the scene, because although the compound microscope had been in use by botanists since the 17th century, until Hassall applied it to the fight against food fraud, it just simply hadn't been used. It wasn't seen as a tool for fighting food fraud. Hassall, by the time of his 30s, had already retired from medical practice and needed a hobby. So he set himself up with a private laboratory and obviously with a microscope in it. And he was the first to apply systematic microscopy to the detection of food adulteration. In his autobiography, which was published in 1893, he wrote, I commenced by examining microscopically sections of whole coffee berry, unroasted and roasted, and then roasted the berry after being ground. And then the roasted berry after being ground. In the same way, I examined the raw and roasted chicory root. I now had some viable data to proceed on and found that roasting and partial charring and blackening by no means destroy the beautiful miniature structures and tissues entering into the composition of the coffee berry and the chicory root. And the key thing, of course, with coffee and chicory is one is a berry and one is a root. So botanically, they are very different and easy to distinguish one from the other under the microscope. And I find it interesting to note that despite the sophisticated array of analytical equipment that we have with us today in laboratories, and perhaps more so in the government chemist laboratory than in mine, that the use of the microscope is still a very valuable tool. And in fact, it's still a compulsory part of the final stage of the mastership in chemical analysis examination. If you can't perform practical microscopy to identify unknown substances under exam conditions, you don't become a public analyst, or you don't become eligible to be appointed as a public analyst. Hassall presented his findings to the Botanical Society in London in August 1850. Thomas Wakeley, who had been publishing The Lancet, which is still with us today, of course, since the 1820s, joined forces with him. And between then and 1854, published the results of examinations of more than 2,500 food samples in editions of The Lancet. And I think in the cabinet we have a sort of a combined volume of those particular reports. And because of their methodical approach and degree of sampling, anecdotal accounts of adulteration became statistical. For example, Hassall was able to say that he looked at 19 samples of ground cinnamon, 6 were genuine, 3 were nothing but cassia, and 10 were bulked up with sago or arrowroot. So Hassall and Wakeley they gave themselves a nice title, the Analytical Sanitary Commission. Hassall wanted to play fair, so he just named the streets where these adulterated foods were being sold initially, but he warned the purveyors of these foods that if, when they came back 3 months later, they were still adulterating the food, he would publish the name of the shopkeeper. This was the original naming and shaming. And Hassall's view was that the honest tradesman or merchant would benefit from this. It's interesting to note from my perspective that Hassall, working more or less on his own as he did, took an average of 625 samples a year over that 4-year period, at a time when the population of London was around 3 million. Population of London today, I gather, is around 8 million. And in 2011-12, the London boroughs, between them, funded from their own budgets the analysis of 1,092 samples for analysis by their public analysts. I think that is a telling statistic. It's one that I find quite telling, that there's perhaps not as much food testing going on as we might like to think. I hasten to add that the testing I'm talking about going on today is only for what is called food standards. It's not to do with microbiological food safety, food hygiene, which is a different matter. So this is the front of the consolidated volume I talked about. And following on Hassall's reports, there was a parliamentary committee of inquiry set up, and that committee sort of confirmed Hassall's evidence and led to the first act to prevent the adulteration of food and drink in 1860. This act was not a success. It was poorly drafted and allowed local authorities to do various things. It didn't require them to do various things. And by 1874, there was general dissatisfaction of both the 1860 Act and a further act in 1872. The food trade were alleging that poor analysis was resulting in unfair prosecutions. Another parliamentary select committee was set up and expressed concerns about the analysts not having sufficient experience and a lack of a definition of adulteration. The committee suggested that the analysts get together and work out what they thought adulteration was. So they were putting it into the hands of the experts of the day. So in 1874, the Society of Public Analysts was founded. And one of the first things they did was to work on definitions of adulteration, both for food and drugs. Initially, the proceedings of the Society were published in the Chemical News, but to quote a source I've read, a little friction arose. And in 1876, the first issue of The Analyst was published, which of course we still have today, one of the Society's flagship journals. So the Society's definition of adulteration became the sort of basis for the 1875 Act. So we have there one part, and in the 1875 Act, the fine for a first offence of falling foul of this was for £50. And here we're seeing this part is covering what today we would probably call food fraud. And the fine for a first offence under that section was £20. So I'll just say a little bit about the Society of Public Analysts. This is a picture of its first president, Theophilus Redwood, who, those of you who have ever seen the Presidential Medal of the Analytical Division will know that it's his picture which is on there. Redwood was apprenticed to an apothecary in Cardiff at the age of 14, involved in setting up the Pharmaceutical Society, became its first professor of pharmacy, later held a joint chair of pharmacy and chemistry, associated with the first edition of the British Pharmacopoeia. So obviously a very, very busy man, and in addition he was public analyst for a number of authorities. By 1890 there was a move to amalgamate the Society of Public Analysts with the Institute of Chemistry, but it came to nothing. However, there was a relations between the two, and in 1896 the Institute set up the Branch E exam in the analysis of waters, foods and drugs, which became recognised as the qualification for public analysts by the local government board in 1900. So the successor to that is the Mastership in Chemical Analysis, of course. By 1906, the Society of Public Analysts became the Society of Public Analysts and Other Analytical Chemists. And by 1953, the public analysts within that society, I think, well, I don't know what happened, but there was a parting of the ways in 1953, and two bodies emerged from the parting. One was the Society of Analytical Chemistry, which, of course, in 1980 became the Analytical Division of the Royal Society of Chemistry, and the Association of Public Analysts was formed almost exactly 60 years ago. The Society of Public Analysts held an annual dinner until 1902, apart from in 1901 when the dinner was cancelled because of the death of Queen Victoria. And they were then held biannually until the First World War, and then they stopped. The tradition revived in 1930. And in 1930, Punch artist George Morrow was present and produced this cartoon. It shows public analysts still at work even when they're enjoying a formal dinner. And I'm pleased to say that the association generally holds a formal dinner every year to coincide with its annual conference. You might recognise one or two people in that picture. In fact, there are three people who you must recognise, because three of the people in that picture are in the room. So I'll just say I've mentioned the Presidential Medal of what was the Society of Public Analysts and now Analytical Division. This is the sort of badge and medal, Presidential Medal of the APA, which I was wearing in that picture, but you couldn't see it. It's sort of partly symbolic and partly descriptive. We have the blue of the air, the soil, and also the water. Mortar and pestle for grinding up reagents and preparing samples for analysis. The sword of justice, flanked on one side by ears of grain representing food, and the poppy on the other representing the drug. The book at the top might be a method book, or it might be a book of the law, because the analysis is, in the widest sense of the word, of course, forensic. And down at the bottom, there's a 1 gram weight, because we need to weigh things out. So, going back to the legislation, this is the sort of key points of the 1985 Act. And it's interesting that the final part there is repeated almost word for word in the current primary legislation in the UK for the Food Safety Act 1990. So this wording, which was obviously laboured over in the 19th century, is still there, even though, of course, the sort of sections of the Act are underpinned by volumes of UK and European legislation. Just say, obviously, there were a number of public analysts. 1860, there were only a couple appointed, or three rather, in London, Birmingham and Dublin. 1872, more were appointed. And the first public analysts came from a variety of professions. Some were already practicing commercial chemists, so they got their hands dirty doing analysis for people who needed it for their business. Others were chemistry teachers, yet others from a medical background. And when the Society of Public Analysts was formed, there were 63 members, and for some reason or other, 15 other public analysts didn't want to join the society at that time. The work of the first public analysts was unique in that they started with almost no knowledge of the composition of food, and equally, almost no knowledge of reliable methods of analysis, which is something that, as an analytical chemist today, I take for granted. I can build on the work of generations of people that have gone before and developed robust methods. Often, in addition to their role of the analysis of food and drugs, they had responsibilities covering water and coal gas, because supplies of both were under municipal control at that stage. This is a picture, as you can see, of A.H. Allen, as he was known. He started off working for Hassall at the age of 16 as a laboratory assistant. This was in 1862, when Hassall was obviously a very prominent man in the area of food analysis. And he moved to Sheffield and became public analyst for the city of Sheffield in 1873, when he was just 27 years old. As well as his day-to-day work, he published over 150 papers and a 13-volume set of commercial organic analysis. Now, the use of the word organic is not used in the same way as we would today. What it means there is analysis of organic materials, so analysis of foods and other biological materials. Another public analyst who's sort of close to my heart is Thomas Fairley. He, like me, attended Edinburgh University, and in 1872 he was teaching chemistry at Leeds Grammar School. The Sanitary Committee of Leeds City Council decided they ought to appoint a public analyst, and at first, if I remember correctly, they advertised the job at £50 a year salary, and the analyst was allowed to keep any fees from private analysis. They didn't get any applicants, so they immediately doubled the salary to £100 a year, but the downside of that was that any fees had to go back to the corporation. So this is a copy from the minutes from 1872. 3 applicants, 1 selected. Later on in his career, Thomas Fairley became a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, so he obviously maintained connections with the university and the city. This is from his a quarterly report. He looked at 32 samples. And still today, I publish, it has been quarterly until fairly recently, but in the last year or two it's gone to twice yearly, a report of observations on all of the unsatisfactory samples that we look at in Leeds for West Yorkshire. That's available on the web if you can find it, but basically every unsatisfactory sample, and that's probably about 35% of the samples we look at, the comment is recorded and it's on the public record what we're finding wrong with the foods that we look at. Here are some of his comments. I hope you can read them. I find the language it's quite descriptive, isn't it? I'm not sure you get away with it today in a report or a certificate. Inferior quality and so on. Yes, the tea being tolerably good. I like that. So having had a race through history, well, not all the way through history, obviously only from 1820 to 1875 or so, I'll move on to sort of talk about food fraud. I mentioned the EU committee. It's just published a report, and it's quite interesting reading in the context of the things I've just been talking about. EU law does not currently provide a definition of food fraud. Well, public analysts really worked on that in the 1870s. Different states have different approaches, and the committee considered that a uniform approach and definition was essential to get a harmonized approach across the EU. The report cites a publication from the Journal of Food Science looking at the top 10 products, which you can read there. It seems to acknowledge, the committee acknowledges that combating food fraud is a relatively new issue on the European agenda, and in the past, I assume they mean the recent past, it's never been a key priority for legislation and enforcement at an EU national level. Because we've, certainly in the last 20 years, official controls, as they're called, focus mainly on food safety, and that's largely microbiological food safety or food hygiene, as I would call it, and not on the quality and the authenticity of food. So it's the committee is calling on the Commission to bring in extra controls in respect of food fraud, and recommends that the Food and Veterinary Office, who is the organisation that audits bodies doing food controls in the EU, include in their audits a so-called mass balance check on input and output flows. An example of that is Manuka honey, which some of you may have heard of, some of you may use. It comes from New Zealand. It has antibiotic properties, but apparently there is about as much Manuka honey sold in the UK as is produced in New Zealand. And of course, Manuka honey isn't just sold in the UK, so there is scope for mass balance to be carried out there, I think. So we've said that there isn't a European definition of food fraud. This task force, which reported in 2007, it's interesting, it was a final report, as if to say, well, we've dealt with it now, back in 2007, came up with that definition. So just because we've been talking about adulteration, there are similarities and differences. And of course, back in the 19th century, most of the acts of adulteration would take place close to the final point of sale, except in the case of truly exotic foods, those who were travelling across continents, the spices and so on. So I've got a number of examples of food frauds past and present, which I will go through. Hassall, as I said, used the microscope. This is ginger under the microscope, and you see the sorts of cells there you'd expect in a root. Ginger with sand is an interesting commodity, isn't it? A retired public analyst from Birmingham did a sort of quite an interesting volume which he wrote in 1932, summarising a lot of legal cases where food adulteration had been reported and acted on and people prosecuted. And he referred to a sample taken in Bingley, as you see, in 1894, and it had some sand in it. And then the case against the seller was dismissed because the magistrates who, are there any magistrates in the audience? Any magistrates in the audience? No, right. I'm sure perhaps there are magistrates in the web audience, yes. But magistrates are often of independent mind, aren't they? But the case against the seller was dismissed because the magistrates considered that if people wanted to buy cheap ginger, then they must expect it to have a certain amount of dirt in it. Moving on a little way to sample taken by West Yorkshire Trading Standards, which had rather more ash in it. And this ginger had been imported between February and November 1999 and packed in Boston and Lincolnshire. The importers had made no checks on the material, but it was estimated, because of what they'd bought and what they'd sold, that 23 tonnes of ginger, which would have contained 4 tonnes of sand, had been distributed. The company were fined £7,500 and asked to pay £591 in costs. So the irony there is that the company had been carrying out checks which were as simple as weighing out some ginger, putting it into a crucible, putting it into a muffle furnace, and seeing how much was left. Sand, of course, will survive a 500-degree muffle furnace more or less indefinitely. But they'd stopped doing that because the households in the vicinity of the factory complained about the smell. So they had been working to have what's called do some due diligence, but they stopped doing it because people didn't like the smell and ended up in a difficult place. Many spices are not as exotic as they once were, but saffron, I think, remains tantalizingly so. It's nothing more, as you probably know, than the dried stigmas of an autumn flowering crocus, but it's resistant to modern horticultural technology. So the fragile blossoms must be gathered by hand from ancient fields in Iran, Greece, Italy, southern France, Spain. Safflower, marigold, and turmeric are all used as substitutes. In medieval Germany, apparently, merchants caught adulterating saffron were burnt at the stake, which makes a £7,500 fine seem quite paltry, doesn't it? But saffron adulteration isn't a thing of the past. It's something which is going on today. I know it's going on today, perhaps not as badly as this case we had in 1999. And this, to me, is an example of sophistication. The sample contained other bits of the crocus that weren't the appropriate part, but they had clearly been separated from the saffron and coloured, and then all mixed together again. And I have here, you can have a look at it later, the genuine article at the top and some coloured floral waste at the bottom. The perpetrators of this fraud were never found. My colleagues in Trading Standards did quite a bit of investigative work, but the trail went cold at a boarded up premises in Edinburgh. They'd obviously been using a false address. Milk, it's one of our staple foods, and we take fresh milk for granted every day of the year. But of course, before the advent of refrigeration, railways, and the rearrangement of the cow's natural breeding cycle, this wasn't the case. And milk has been used as an example of how hard it was to feed a city the size of London before the age of steam, because, of course, it's perishable. So it either had to be produced as close to the city as possible, or in inner-city cow sheds. Suburban cows would be milked at 3 o'clock in the morning and carried to the town in open pails. Milk would be allowed to settle. A bit of skimming could go on. Milk could be watered, etc., etc. And even if the milk was free of disease when it left the cow, it might not have been by the time it got there. I'll just read you a little bit out from the Expedition of Humphrey Clinker, written in 1771. But the milk itself should not pass unanalyzed. The product of the faded cabbage leaves and sour draught, lowered with hot water, frothed with bruised snails, carried through the streets in open pails, exposed to foul rinsings discharged from doors and windows, spittle, snot, and tobacco quids from foot passengers, overflowing from mud carts, dirt and trash chucked into it by roguish boys for a joke's sake, and finally, the vermin that drops from the rags of the nasty drab that vends this precious mixture under the respectable denomination of milkmaid. And perhaps given that, it's hardly surprising that in Paris during the siege of 1870, infant mortality fell by 40% because the mothers had to breastfeed their children rather than giving them what was being sold as milk at that time. The horrors of milk in London and Paris are nothing compared to the scandal of milk in New York in the 19th century. A campaigner called John Millay discovered that, and it's a wonderful American unit this, and I haven't made it metric, 90,000 quarts of milk, and that would be American quarts, I suppose, rather than British quarts, would be brought in from farms by train daily. Yet, 120,000 quarts was delivered to customers. So we've got mass balance going on back in the 19th century. However, this watered milk was harmless when compared to the swill milk produced from cows kept in sheds and fed on hot grain mash, a byproduct of the distillation of whiskey. Not surprisingly, the milk produced by these cows was of very pure nutritional quality and probably, well, it would have been slightly alcoholic into the bargain, only very slightly alcoholic, I hasten to add. But then, to add insult to that injury of selling milk from these cows, which I have read had to be sort of held up so that they could be milked. They were in such poor condition. Even this milk would be watered, have chalk added to it to mask the blue colour, and starch added to thicken it up. Today, we do a lot of routine milk analysis, certainly in Leeds at any rate. And of course, milk production has changed out of all recognition. It's the large dairy farms and huge processors of milk. Very, very much a centralized thing. You might wonder why we measure the freezing point of milk. One of the problems that faced the early analysts, particularly where milk was concerned, was natural variability. The amount of fat was variable, and the amount of Other solids, sugars and proteins in the milk were also variable, simply depending on the diet of the cow, the season, whether it was morning or evening milk. So it was very difficult analytically to pick up small additions of water. So that was until about 1930 when the Horvet apparatus was devised. And this was a means of supercooling a test tube of milk in a bath of ether, which you cooled by blowing air over it. So the evaporation of the ether cooled the milk down below its freezing point. And then the method was to take a tiny ice crystal on the tip of a knife and drop it into the supercooled milk. And of course that would induce freezing, and the temperature of the milk would rise as the latent heat was released, and you could find the freezing point of the milk. And also the freezing point is related to the osmotic potential of the milk, which of course has to be in balance with the cow. And the cow's physiology is such that the osmotic potential of the milk is within certain bounds is fairly well known. So that's why we measure the freezing point of milk to an accuracy of 1/1000th of a degree centigrade. So if we have a sample of milk that comes in and the freezing point is higher than about minus 0.511 degrees, then there's only a 1 in 40 probability that it hasn't been, well, I'll say here, hasn't been watered. In a report, I would say extraneous water, which isn't, of course, the same thing. Adding water, it suggests a deliberate act. Extraneous water, I'm reserving judgment as to how the water might have got there. So I've said public analysts looked at a lot of samples of milk. In Birmingham in the late 1920s, about 54% of the 5,000 samples a year that they were looking at were milk. This leaves about 2,300 other samples that weren't milk. And the population of Birmingham has gone up probably from about 1 million to 1.1 million now. But in 2011-12, Birmingham City did not fund any official sampling off its own bat. So you have a situation where in 1920, 5,000 samples a year being analysed by the public analyst. More recently, no official sampling being funded by the council. Milk, of course, can be adulterated in much more sinister ways than simply adding water, which, of course, although is fraud, assuming the water is wholesome, isn't going to cause anyone any real harm. And we had a little while ago I missed a slide. This is the paper from the analyst outlining the use of the Horvet apparatus to look at milk. The fraud we've had more recently, of course, is the addition of melamine to milk, particularly dried milk in China, and all of the problems that caused. The reason it's added to powdered milk is to boost the apparent protein content, because when from an analytical point of view, when we're talking about analysing a sample for protein, we're not actually measuring protein generally. We're measuring nitrogen and applying a factor. And you can see from the formula of melamine that it's got a lot of nitrogen in it, so it's 66% nitrogen by weight. So adding a small amount of this material to a dry milk powder will boost its apparent protein content. So it will cover up other frauds on the product by bringing its protein content up to something that you might expect. Of course, it does have its consequences, and still in China they seem to have fairly severe penalties for milk fraud or food fraud. Those of you who listen to the panel game, The Unbelievable Truth, on Radio 4 will know that sometimes absurd US state laws are often dropped into the mini-lectures the panelists present on their subjects. One might be, in 1897, it was illegal to sell margarine in New Hampshire or Minnesota unless it was coloured pink. True or false? True, of course. There was a lot of lobbying went on in the States between the dairy industry and the margarine industry. And obviously, Minnesota, New Hampshire, lush areas, lush states, a lot of dairy production. So a big pro-dairy lobby, and wanted people to be sure that if they were buying margarine, they knew what it was. And this was around 1886. There was a huge amount of lobbying going on. Because in America, until 1906, there were no federal laws that made the adulteration of food illegal. Of course, today with the requirement for comprehensive ingredients labelling on food and the size and professionalism of the food manufacturing business, there would be little scope today to find yourself buying margarine instead of butter, unless, of course, you're in a hurry in the supermarket, because they do try and make the labels similar, don't they? But if you're buying food from a catering establishment, a takeaway, or a restaurant, the food that comes out of the kitchen into your takeaway box or your plate might have a different name from when it arrived from the wholesaler. And this is actually a Christmas card I devised some years ago. And the little joke here, which hopefully you will pick up as I go through this, an example of things not being what they are when you buy, in this case, pizzas, is the use of cheese analog, which is a product which is perfectly legal when sold as such. It's a blend of whey powder and vegetable oil, and it's about half the price of mozzarella. Once it's cooked on top of a pizza, it has a very similar stringy consistency, so you'd be hard put to tell the difference, particularly if you were eating your pizza very late at night, having had an enjoyable evening. It's been around since the early 1980s, and as yet it's not been replaced with a new digital cheese. Sorry, that was my one joke. I'm glad that some of you laughed. So in West Yorkshire, where a lot of the samples I look at come from, it's not uncommon to find a Hawaiian pizza, which of course would by custom be topped with mozzarella, ham and pineapple, to contain no cheese, no pork, and supply you with an artery narrowing 6 grams of salt. So there is a product which is known colloquially as turkey ham, which is cured turkey meat, which of course Muslims are much happier handling than obviously they don't want to be handling pork. And that's not a problem if the menu correctly describes the item. But obviously there is no excuse for selling something which isn't cheese and calling it cheese. Are you hearing me, those of you who are still awake? A few, just about, right. I'm finding it I'm trying to keep my head down and into the microphone. So I apologize for not making eye contact with you. I'm conscious that I need to be audible. Beer, of course, was a staple drink in the days before drinking water was generally safe. The production of beer, the boiling and so on, did mean that the liquid was sterile once it had gone through the fermentation process. All sorts of interesting things added to mask the poor quality of the ingredients in beer, including that last one there, which comes from a climbing plant. It's got the fruit from this plant contains a poisonous substance called picrotoxin, which is a convulsive poison. It was one time used, as I say, to adulterate beer, and obviously you got a bit of a kick from the picrotoxin, so you felt, wow, this is a good drink of beer, and has been used as an antidote in morphine poisoning. Those of you who are real ale enthusiasts might think there's a lot of beer adulteration goes on today, or stuff that's sold as beer that isn't, but I won't go into that. I'll just say something about a case we had recently from Barnsley. These were cans of lager, where at first impression, what the fraud here was, somebody had bought pallets and pallets of these very cheaply because they were past their best before date. So the pallets were all carefully unpacked. The original dot matrix printed date codes removed, and new later ones put on. And I think in that picture you can see the two. So this was a case of not applying any chemical analysis to the beer, because there was no doubt that the beer was whatever brand it said on the can, but it was a case of establishing to the satisfaction of the courts that there had been fraud committed in terms of changing the date. So in fact the digits of the dot matrix printer that the criminal used were different from the original. There obviously you can see very clearly that there are two dates on the bottom of the one can. I can barely bring myself to give a lecture without putting this slide up. It's from Punch from November 1858, and it comes from an incident that happened in Bradford. It's also very, very close to where I work. And at this time, of course, sugar was still a luxury food, and it was quite common for cheap sweets to contain clay or plaster of Paris. And it was also common for sweet shops to sell sort of two varieties of the same sweet. One would be the genuine article, which was quite expensive, and then the other one was the cheap one. So people who wanted to feel they were getting a bargain would end up getting something which was partly clay or partly plaster of Paris, which, of course, although not an ideal ingredient for sweets, is not going to do very much harm. But this instance, as you can see from the cartoon, the pharmacist assistant mistook the directions of the pharmacist who was ill. When he was the sweet maker went to the pharmacist to get his usual supply of plaster of Paris, and the pharmacist sort of said to his assistant, well, it's down in the cellar, down on the left, and perhaps the assistant thought it was on the right and whatever. So 20 people died, 200 very ill. A chemist in Bradford, not the one involved in selling the arsenic, called Felix Rimington, analysed some of the lozenges when it became apparent that they were doing some damage, and pronounced that each contained enough arsenic to kill 2 people. Felix Rimington was later president at the first meeting of the Society of Public Analysts, and later became the first public analyst for Bradford, the borough of Bradford. These haven't really got anything to do with anything else that I'm talking about. They came into the lab earlier this week, and I just thought I would share them with you. They're Asian sweets, made locally in West Yorkshire, and they're really quite a colour, aren't they? The reason of that colour is that they have rhodamine B in, which is a fluorescent dye. It's quite often used to trace watercourses because you don't need very much of it to make a strong colour. And these sweets contain only 1 or 2 milligrams per kilogram of rhodamine B. To give you an idea, a permitted artificial food colour might be present at 150, 250 milligrams per kilogram to give a similar hue, though obviously not a similar degree of fluorescence to those. So there's a case of a non-permitted food colour, albeit not a particularly toxic one, being used in foods. But there's something on the RSC website at the moment highlighting the use of carcinogenic dyes in sweets in India. So it's a practice that goes on that dyes, colours that are not suitable for use in food are still being used. And that will let me move on, so there is a link in its way, to one of my favourite quotes. Donald Rumsfeld came under quite a bit of stick at the time, but I think he had something. In 2003, when Donald Rumsfeld said this, Sudan 1 was what I would call an unknown unknown. It's a dye product. It's used in waxes and oils to colour them red, but nobody was looking for it in food. And one of the reasons nobody was looking for it was because it's an oil-soluble colour. The HPLC methodology, or thin layer chromatography, that we use for permitted artificial colours, which are all water-soluble, just won't work. You won't get a separation. Historically, of course, red lead was used to colour red spices, but this came to light. It was discovered in France, but the Sudan one was being added to chili powder in India, presumably to enhance the colour of the chili powder and make it more, perhaps more valuable. So we can apply the Rumsfeld technique to the colours in food, and you see different things there. So, of course, top left we might have sweets or soft drinks, and then we have, of course, sweets that we've just talked about in the top right. There are a number of foods such as pasta and Scotch whisky, of course. Well, there's a slight exception with Scotch whisky. It was only allowed to contain one colour. So some foods that you're not allowed to colour them. And then, of course, you've got the use of non-permitted colours in foods where you can't add colours, which is the example is Sudan 1 in chili powder. This isn't Sudan 1, obviously, but the only difference between Sudan 1 and Allura Red, which is a permitted artificial colour, is that Allura Red has got these sulfonyl groups, SO3 groups, on the molecule, which make it water-soluble. The part of the molecule in the middle that's responsible for its colour is very similar in Allura Red and Sudan 1. But that difference in solubility makes a big difference to the way it's metabolized, and one is permitted and the other isn't. So Sudan 1 came rather out of the blue, and it affected us quite significantly in Leeds, because one of the firms that was first involved is a firm in Huddersfield that made chutneys, and some of the chutneys had chili powder in, and Sudan 1 was found in their chili powder. We very rapidly developed and validated a method for Sudan 1. And there were a whole family of illegal dyes started to come out of the woodwork once we started looking for them. There's Sudan 1's close relatives, 2, 3, and 4, and Para Red and various other ones. But obviously the level in the chili powder is quite high. By the time you get into the chutney, it's much lower. So that was 2003. Legislation was introduced to require batches of chili powder being imported into the EU to be checked for Sudan 1. And it stopped being an unknown. We knew about it and we were looking for it. But then, of course, a bit later, 2005, there was the Worcestershire sauce incident, which until the Horsemeat scandal, not an incident, was one of the biggest recalls we've ever had. A lot of the recall was on the basis of traceability, because the chili powder went into the Worcestershire sauce, and the Worcestershire sauce went into a whole range of ready meal shepherd's pies and so on that were being sold by numerous retailers. So it was done on the basis of traceability rather than analysis. One of the interesting things from my perspective is that the Worcestershire sauce was made in, let me check, Rochdale. So across the Pennines from Yorkshire, so not in my patch. But the contaminated Worcester sauce, the contamination was picked up in Italy. Why was it not picked up in Rochdale, I wonder? Obviously, there was a big hue and cry, but in the end, Rochdale Metropolitan Borough Council decided not to prosecute the manufacturer of the Worcestershire sauce for some reason. It was interesting, the Food Standards Agency approach to this, particularly, as I've said, there were really only, you see from the, if we just go back to the chutney, you would probably have similar levels of Sudan 1 in the Worcestershire sauce as you would in the chutney, perhaps even lower levels. So by the time you put your Worcestershire sauce into a ready meal, the levels are going to be very low. The New Zealand Food Safety Authority decided that the risk was immeasurably small and consumers shouldn't be alarmed. But in the UK, the products were withdrawn because of the tiny risk of contracting, or the increased risk of contracting cancer because of consuming the products. Yes, it's not my best photograph, that, is it? Any guesses? Cheese, yes, it's cheese. It's red-coloured cheese. Frederick Accum goes on quite a bit about cheese. The text is available through the Gutenberg project, the American website, so you can download it. You can even download it onto your Kindle. And he writes at some length about a gentleman who was residing in the west of England, and he had some cheese on toast at night. But after he went to bed, he was seized with a distressing but indescribable pain in the region of the abdomen and the stomach, accompanied with a feeling of tension, which occasioned much restlessness, anxiety, and repugnance to food. In the morning, he mentioned this to the mistress of the inn, who was surprised because the cheese had come not from some country dealer, but a highly respectable shop in London, no less. So his fears were allayed, and a few days later he had some more of the same cheese, and the same thing resulted. So some investigations were carried out by a chemist in the vicinity, which is nice to think there's a chemist in the vicinity, who came back with the result: the cheese was contaminated with lead. So inquiries were made of the dealer, and the dealer said that he'd got his annatto, which is obviously used to colour cheese, from a mercantile traveller who had been supplying him for years with no problems. But further inquiries revealed at some length that the manufacturer of the cheese, or on the part of the manufacturer of the cheese, that the annatto had been defective and of inferior quality, and recourse had been had to the expedient of colouring the commodity with vermilion, which of course is mercuric sulfide. Accum didn't seem to have much problem with mercury. He didn't think of it as being toxic. He was always very worried about lead and copper, but he doesn't really worry about mercury poisoning very much, because he says that even this admixture could not be considered deleterious. But on further application being made to the druggist who had sold the vermilion, it was discovered that the vermilion had been mixed up with a portion of red lead. So there you have a whole series of events, and we think that the food supply chain is complicated today, don't we? Clearly, there was Accum talks about circuitous and diversified operations of commerce. So perhaps nothing changes. Today, of course, we can analyze the components in annatto, the different bixins and non-bixins. So this is a set of standards separated on HPLC, and what we might find in a legally coloured cheese with annatto in to make it red. Moving on to fish. Of course, Accum didn't write about fish. In his day, it would be sold as a fresh commodity. The main problems would with it be putrefying in the summer, of course, because of the lack of refrigeration. And people would be buying the fish with the skin and the head on, which makes it quite easy to see if you're buying a plaice or a dab or a haddock or a cod or whatever. Today we see a lot of substitution of species, particularly where the items are breaded. You can use a cheaper fish, and indeed adulteration with added water. There's a fish which is farmed in Vietnam called Vietnamese catfish, which for a while, it was a relatively new commodity onto the UK market. For a while, 3 years ago or so, most of the stuff being sold, even by the big retailers, contained perhaps 30, 40, 50% added water. And we're just working at the moment through the, Derrick mentioned the Analytical Methods Committee of the Royal Society of Chemistry. One of its subcommittees is the Nitrogen Factors Subcommittee, which is wonderfully obscure, isn't it? But it's been doing some work funded by the Food Standards Agency to establish a nitrogen factor for Vietnamese catfish, which will allow a reliable measure of what you would expect the protein content to be, which obviously is diminished on the addition of water. So we see substitution of fish, adulteration with added water. But clearly, this headline, which is some time ago now, it was still salmon, but it wasn't wild. So to distinguish between farmed and wild salmon, we developed a method looking at anthaxanthin. And the wonderful thing about anthaxanthin is it has, how many chiral centers does it have? Anyway, it must have 2 chiral centers. But if you buy your anthaxanthin from a chemical plant in Switzerland, which is what you need to do if you've got a salmon farm, and you're not farming organically, you get the 4 different versions are produced in equal portions, but 2 of them are indistinguishable, the mesoform. So if having extracted your pigment from the salmon, you get a chromatogram like that, you know it's farmed, whereas if it's wild, all of the anthaxanthin is the 3S3-S form, so there's just one peak towards the left-hand side there. Moving on to spirits, this cartoon was published following a letter I had published in New Scientist a few years ago, when there was correspondence about additives in spirit drinks. I mentioned whiskey earlier. I was horrified during my career as a public analyst to discover that whiskey blenders are allowed to put caramel into whiskey, which is really scandalous, isn't it? But that's to ensure that a blended whiskey, which of course is blended on the nose so that it has the same smell as all the other batches, has a uniform colour, because people expect a product like that to have a uniform colour. So a little bit of caramel is all right. There are other additives added to some of the well-known brands of spirits, which, for instance, Smirnoff, Bacardi and so on, Gordon's Gin, which I won't describe in detail, but I know what they are because the producers tell public analysts what they're putting in. So we check branded spirits sold in pubs to see that they are what they say they are. So is the spirit on the optic bells, or is it a cheaper whiskey that was on offer at the cash and carry that week? So we don't need a whole bottle, of course. We never get a whole bottle. It's only just 25 millilitres we get in for analysis. So a bit of artistic license going on there. More worrying than substitution, of course, is counterfeit vodka, which I think can hardly have escaped anyone's attention over the last few years. It first came to my attention back in about 1997 with counterfeit Stolichnaya, which at that time was a virtually unknown brand in the UK, which was basically diluted industrial methylated spirits. So, of course, IMS, when it starts out at, it's about 4% methanol. So when diluted down to bottling strength, it's obviously got enough methanol in a bottle to blind someone. More recently, we've seen a whole variety of contaminants in counterfeit vodka, and you can see some of them there. I talk about counterfeit vodka, that's where you have a recognized brand, Stolichnaya, Smirnoff, Glen's, which isn't, it's a counterfeit product. Now, I don't know if you drink Smirnoff. Nobody, you might? So you're familiar with the bottle. I mean, some of you must have been in a public house once or twice and seen the Smirnoff bottle, which is quite heavily embossed. Well, the people who are making counterfeit Smirnoff are making their own counterfeit bottles as well. So now you can water down industrial alcohol in a garage and fill plain bottles and print a label on a computer. Glen's is a plain bottle. But you can't really make bottles in your garage. It's obviously quite a big operation. So there are counterfeit vodkas, and there are also fake vodkas, which are entirely fictitious brands. I'll just pass over that quickly. But these are examples of fake vodkas. And the one on the right, the drop vodka, is quite clever because it talks about its aroma. Now, vodka doesn't really have an aroma because it's, no matter what the adverts say, it's ethanol and water. But the manufacturers of this wonderful drop vodka, which for a while at least had its own Facebook page, it was very popular with students in Sheffield for a time, because of the isopropanol in it, of course, did have an aroma. So they kindly drew that to your attention, so as that when your nose was hovering over the glass, you thought, oh, that's the aroma. So, I mean, it is dangerous stuff, and one of the things that concerns me is that we've developed rapid methodology to let us know quite quickly if there's large amounts of methanol there, and similarly chloroform, which of course is toxic as well. Isopropanol is only about twice as toxic as ethanol, so that's not really an issue of toxicity. But we're looking for things which will tell us that it's fake. But we're clearly not doing a complete comprehensive analysis. We don't know where this alcohol is coming from. We don't know whether it's already been through an industrial process. So how dangerous is it? We don't really know. I have heard anecdotal evidence from people who work on A&E, and generally young people are coming in suffering from the ill effects of counterfeit vodka, and it seems to be far worse than you would expect if it was only the things that we are finding in it and the ethanol that was in it. So there's perhaps some scope for research there to find out what is in it, other than the things that we find. The difficulty is, of course, it's not produced to a controlled process, so every batch is different. So it's you're trying to hit a moving target. We tend to think of bacon when we think of added water, the puddle in the frying pan along with the white scum. I've talked about nitrogen factors. There's work going on at the moment to re-examine nitrogen factors for bacon, because when we look at bacon which is imported from our European neighbours, it's never got quite as much meat in it as it says, and there's always a little bit more added water than there should be. But that's because they work things out differently over there, and perhaps the breeds of pigs are different. So just this morning we got in various samples of pork which has been slaughtered and butchered under controlled conditions, both from the UK and from the Netherlands. So we're hoping to be able to establish nitrogen factors which will let us work out protein and meat contents and hence added water reliably. So that work is ongoing. Meat production in the United States became industrialized before the UK. Back in 1906, a gentleman called Upton Sinclair produced a book called The Jungle. And that was the same year that the Pure Food and Drugs Act came into force. And that book described the dreadful working conditions and unscrupulous practices that went on in the Chicago stockyards, where, according to him, infested meat, together with rats, their droppings, and the poison put down to kill them, would all go into the mix. Hams were injected with curing brines. It's a book, to quote B. Wilson, which is about a system of food production in which adulteration is the only currency. So some of you may remember the Panorama program from about 2003, when there were some very graphic pictures of chicken breast being injected with water to increase its weight. This chicken is imported either from Brazil or Indonesia, and water and hydrolyzed proteins are added. So this is the type of product which is generally sold wholesale with maybe 40% added water. And you see in there hydrolyzed protein, brackets poultry. Well, the question is it poultry or is it beef or is it pork? And the proteins are so hydrolyzed that there might not be enough DNA in them to reliably identify it. So that brings on to the use of proteomics, where you're looking at the actual individual proteins. And if you have enough data, you can say, well, this sequence of amino acids in the protein could only have come from pork or from beef, or indeed chicken. Moving on to horse. Sorry, how much time have I got? A couple of minutes. Oh, God. Perhaps I'll just stop and we won't get as far as Horsemeat. Right, I'll just say about the 29.1% horse without going through the slides, actually. That's perhaps the thing to do. This figure, of course, achieved some prominence at the beginning of the Horsemeat scandal. But in fact, there is a huge amount of spurious precision there. The real-time polymerase chain techniques that are used to semi-quantify the amount of horse or beef or pork DNA in the product will only give you a guide. That's because there's a variable amount of DNA even in a pure meat. The DNA that's replicated comes from mitochondria, so a fit racehorse will have more mitochondrial DNA than a horse nearing the end of its natural life. So to say 29.1% horse was just completely spurious. Probably a more accurate, if that's the right word, figure would have been between 20 and 40% horse. Right. Now, I'll just very quickly go through all of these slides, because I've been too long-winded. This is my concluding slide. You'll be pleased to hear, Pauline. I think, despite me rambling on too long, I hope you've got an idea that food adulteration has always been with us. Accum was ahead of his time, but the new concept of public health coincided with Hassall's work, and that gave us the legislation which has been developed. Since then, there's been a battle between the fraudster and the public analysts and other analysts working in enforcement. We've got tried and tested analysis together with the power of DNA, stabilized ratios, proteomics, which can match many of the frauds. However, these techniques are out of the public analyst's reach simply because local authorities are not willing to fund such work. And only time will tell if the Horsemeat scandal and the numerous reviews that are ongoing will result in a reversal and decline of local authority sampling that I've referred to as we've gone, and the amount of testing that we're able to do. So I'll leave you with this image. I do hope that public analysts will continue to find the answer to the question, what's in our food? Just some acknowledgements there of copyright, and then a quiz, which you can think about and speak to me afterwards. You see the scale there? It's a micrograph. Is that food? So I will stop there before I get into more trouble.
Thank you very much, Duncan. That was a very fascinating presentation. I think perhaps as we look forward to the future, maybe a good look back in the past will tell us what we might expect in terms of future fraud. And I know it's a massive global problem in my travels around the world. So we have a short amount of time, about 5 minutes or so, to answer to having some questions, which I'm sure you don't mind answering.
I will try to answer them, yes.
I throw the floor open to questions.
Yeah, thank you for a very entertaining talk. The chairman of Iceland recently was asked a question about horsemeat, and he said, of course we don't test for horsemeat or cat or dog, right, in our samples. I mean, do you think the emphasis should be more on the suppliers to, ensure the quality of their products when they're selling it, rather than leaving it to the guys like yourselves?
Well, anyone who produces food has an obligation to make sure that that product is legal, and we have traceability through the supply chain. So yes, they should have their checks in place, but you can't solve all problems by analysis, clearly, because it would simply be not possible. But I think there is a balance. The big manufacturers, the big supermarkets, have got a lot of their own processes in place. They do a lot of their own testing, but clearly they're not covering everything. And any company who is supplying a supermarket is in a very difficult place. They've got a big customer who is calling the shots, and the margins are being, squeezed all the time. And because I think in the UK we don't really value our food, price is a big issue. No matter what we might think about quality and so on, when we're there at the supermarket, very often it's the price, particularly in the current climate. So there's a lot of pressure, but I think this should have been, hopefully a wake-up call, and people will try and shorten the supply chain so that things are not going through so many pairs of hands. I think I have read that a supermarket lasagna, there are 240 transactions before you buy it at the supermarket. Some of those supply chains are obviously very long. The difficulty, of course, is that in the UK we only produce about half of the food that we need. So there is a limit to how short the supply chain can be. And I think there are concerns that because some of the big retailers are now shortening their supply chains, that's mopping up the UK-produced beef or whatever, and then the smaller concerns without the buying power of the supermarkets are then having to look further afield. And they've got fewer resources to do the checks that the big players should have been doing and pick this up.
The long version of the question would be, what do you personally do to try to avoid this? And I guess the short version of the question is, what are you having for dinner tonight?
Well, I'm not having dinner as such. I managed the sandwich on the way here, and I might have something later on. But I think as a family, we try to buy. I say we. My wife, who's sitting at the back, is the one who normally goes shopping, apart from my Saturday trip to the greengrocer. We try to buy ingredients, rather than finished meals. But that can be difficult if you're pressured for time and money. So eat simply. And reduce the salt. I touched on salt there. That's one thing that I've changed in my diet, is I've learned more about the dangers of salt, is to reduce it. We make our own bread and I don't put any salt in it, for instance. And you get used to the taste. It's an expectation. It's the same with sugar. I was at a meeting talking about salt, and somebody was there from the World Health Organization, and they didn't draw a distinction between the tobacco industry, the alcohol industry, the sugar industry, and the salt industry. He saw those as being equally, all in the same boat together. Buy our product, don't really care about what it's going to do to your health.
Thanks very much. This is more of a comment, but I'd ask you for your reaction. I don't know to the extent to which an analyst such as you would find things. So I'll start again. It was a wonderful book I read fairly recently called Not on the Label, and it talks about the processes that chicken goes through in order to get chicken nuggets and things like this. And had you would never eat a chicken nugget or a bit of processed chicken again if you actually read the book. To what extent can people like yourself actually do something about this to, I guess, make the food that we eat a little bit more, not organic, but fresher?
Well, the analysis that we do is to help enforce the raft of food legislation. And if something is legal, even though I personally don't like it, I can't do anything about it. And even when I find a legal issue, something which is wrong with food, which is a breach of the criminal law in the UK, some of my client authorities don't have the resources to pursue that as much as they might have done even 4 or 5 years ago. So it's like I was saying earlier about Caroline Walker saying that there used to be adulteration and now there are additives. So if the additive is on the label, then it's fine. What you're saying is all about things like processing aids and the degree of processing, which is something which, as you say, isn't on the label. I think the only thing you can do to guard against that is to know what you're buying and think, well, has this been processed? And if you don't like it, don't buy it. I know that's not there isn't really an answer to that question, I don't think.
I think we've got time for one more last question.
I speak as a layman, but I imagine that I speak for many people, some people here. But when you go into a supermarket and it says our foods show full traceability, or we can trace foods back, is that, in view of what you just said, is that really realistic to assume, therefore, that the stuff you're buying is perfectly safe, or is it partly true?
Well, there are actually two things there. One is to do with safety, which is linked to traceability, but something can be fully traceable and not safe. The traceability, there is a requirement under EU law, no matter where you are on the food supply chain, you should be, if you're in the middle, you should be able to say, well, I bought this from X and I'm selling it to Y. The difficulty is, as we've seen this with the Horsemeat scandal, is if someone is deliberately out to defraud you, the product can leave premises A labelled as horse, and by the time it arrives at premises B, it's labelled as beef. And no amount of paper traceability is going to solve that problem where someone is deliberately trying to commit fraud, which is what it is.
Okay, it's now after 8 o'clock, so I'm sure Duncan will be hanging around for a drink afterwards. So plenty of opportunity for you to ask any questions that I haven't been able to pick up now. So just leaves me to thank Duncan again. It was a fascinating talk. I think you could have gone on for
obviously
for plenty of time.
I was going on too long.
With all of the examples of food fraud that he's seen over the course of the last few years. So just before we end, if we'd like to put our hands together again and thank Dan.